Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome. It's an honor for me to be able to welcome our final day of the conference on cultural diplomacy and international economics with a very special keynote speaker. Just arrived last night from the UK, and I think in many ways this morning will be a highlight also of the conference. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Charles Clarke read mathematics and economics at King's College in Cambridge. He is now a visiting professor in politics at the University of East Anglia. He was president of the National Union of Students and then a Labour councillor in Hackney before working for Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, as his chief of staff. He was elected a Labour Member of Parliament for Norwich South from 1997 until 2010. In 1998, he joined the government, first as junior minister, and then joining the cabinet in 2001 as Labour Party chair. Then he became Secretary of State for Education and Skills, and finally, I think the highlight of the career, Home Secretary, where he served until 2006. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a special honor to have Mr. Clarke here, and I very much also look forward to the topic that he has chosen, because it's a topic that I don't think we've given enough attention to over the past days. The topic for the lecture is expanding educational capacities and opportunities, overcoming political obstacles. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a very, very warm welcome for the Honorable Mr. Charles Clarke. Thank you.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for that nice introduction. I must say it's absolutely tremendous to be here. I've not been in this offices before, and it's really, really splendid. I have visited the Story of Berlin museum downstairs, and I'd recommend that to anybody who hasn't yet had a chance to look at it as a story of this extraordinary city and the history which it has gone through. Part of the education experience I tried to promote was to get museums and education closer to each other, and I think it's quite an important thing. I also apologise that there's a slight uncertainty in me today. When I was at the airport yesterday in Norwich on my way coming here, my new glasses collapsed. And so I bought in the hotel, in the airport duty-free, a £12 pair of glasses, which are slightly racier than I normally have. They're green rather than the rather sober, dark colours I'd normally choose. But if there's a slight uncertainty, I apologise, and that's the reason. I'm really honoured to be here, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I've learnt a bit about the work of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, and it's extremely important work, and I'm delighted to contribute to this event. I wanted to focus on education, since it seems to me so central if one is going to try and address the issues of inequality which are so dominant throughout the world. It's obviously the case that there's a high correlation between earnings and wealth and levels of education. It's not an absolute correlation, but there is a very high correlation. It's obvious too these days that there is a world marketplace in people at certain levels of education, and literally people try and join this world marketplace in order to be able to have successful and profitable careers in future. But I want to go slightly deeper than that, because my deep, deep belief is that education is the source of all human development. It's through education that societies are able to move forward, through the application of intelligence that people can fulfill themselves, and that it ought to be an aspiration of everybody involved in politics, in public life, to enable every single person to be able to fulfill their own abilities to the best of their possible talents. And of course that requires education and the ability to use it. And one of the biggest tragedies of the world today is there are literally billions of people who, as a result of circumstances which are no fault of theirs in any respect whatsoever, aren't able to fulfill themselves in the way they would wish to do so, and who would benefit from education to benefit both themselves and the wider society of which they're part. That's an argument that has gone on forever. But I think there's a particular argument of the moment, of the time, which is that change is happening far faster in the world than the world has ever seen, whether it's economic change, technological change, social change. The speed of change throughout the world is quite extraordinary. And the question that faces everybody is, are we to be the people who are driven by this change, or can we somehow take control of this process of change and ensure that the process of change benefits all of us? Are we just to be knocked around in these circumstances, or are we to be able to move it forward? Just to give some obvious examples, if the production of coal and steel is changing very rapidly throughout the world as a result of technological change, and you get whole closures of coal mines or steel factories or whatever, and whole communities put out of work with absolutely no possibility of productive work in the future. Is that change something we can somehow get hold of and make sure it doesn't work in that negative way, and can we make it work positively? Now, education is the route to that. It's the route for every individual, and it's the route for societies as a whole. So the importance of education remains absolutely central to our societies in every respect. And in that sense, I think part of the job of making the argument for education to address inequality has been done. It has been completed. Governments throughout the world understand these days the importance of education. They're ready to allocate resources towards improving education. They're ready to commit their own societies to trying to ensure they have far higher numbers of educated people in their countries. And in that sense, as I say, the argument is one, it's been taken forward. But in another sense, it simply means that only the first step has been taken, because the kind of educational change which is needed in order to reduce inequalities, the way in which resources are spent in order to reduce inequalities, these are not obvious questions which have obvious answers. It's not obvious how you deal with it and take it forward. And what I hope to do this morning is to discuss these issues and try and indicate some of the challenges we face in using educational expansion in order to reduce inequalities. Some people think that simply expanding education is enough. That does the job. It doesn't. It's a question of the type of education, the way that education takes place, the people who benefit from education, at what points in their lives they benefit from education, and it's that which needs the analysis and the discussion. But I should say we're starting, I emphasize at the beginning, at the positive point that almost all societies, almost all governments know that they need to invest in education, that it's important for the future of their countries, want to find ways to do it, and want to commit themselves to making that change. And the result is that education is expanding faster than ever in history throughout the world, from preschool education through primary, secondary, vocational educational, university education. There is a massive expansion of education taking place today, not always, in my opinion, targeted in the most effective ways. So I'm going to focus what I say around two words: investment and reform. Investment, the question of how investment in education happens, where it's targeted, and reform, the question of changing education systems in order that they can perform more effectively and in order that they can tackle the issues of inequality where they exist in individual countries and individual circumstances. So to begin with investment. And I'm going to tackle each of the areas of education, as I say, preschool, primary, secondary, vocational, university, and ultimately research levels as well. These are a wide range of different educational responsibilities for individual countries. And to match that, there are a wide range of potential sources of investment, many of them controversial and challenging. The most important source of investment is government money through the tax system. The tax is providing money which governments spend on education. There are a lot of issues in principle, which I'll come to in a moment, about how well they do that and whether educational independence of thinking can be protected as governments allocate money in that way. But the government remains the single most important source of resources for education in most countries, not all countries, but most countries. The second important source is the private individual. The question of whether the individual who benefits from education pays themselves something towards the education that they receive. This is most obvious to see at the level of university education, where in some countries in the world, the United States for example, there are very substantial fees which people pay for their own education and for which in return they receive an education which leads to a qualification which they hope will help them in their future lives and in the economic marketplace. I was responsible in the UK for bringing in a system of student fees, university fees in the UK, which was a very controversial set of changes, not on the same basis as the United States, because the money is paid back by the student after they've graduated through the tax system according to however much they've earned. So it's not a fee they have to pay up front to deal with the situation. But it was very controversial, and the central argument was this investment argument I was making, if the government has money to invest in education and it wants to address equality, is the best way to invest in education to put money into preschool education or primary education, where all the research indicates the best results come in terms of attacking inequality, or into university education? Or should we recognise that those who go into universities do get a benefit from their university life, and including a financial benefit to them? And there's a great deal of work that shows if you've got a university degree, in general, you get more money throughout your life as a result of that, and should you pay something in respect of that? It was a very difficult and problematic debate in Britain, but it was an important one. But it just highlights the second question: does the private individual pay? If we were to go to India today, we'd find many, many schools throughout the country where private individuals are trying, often from very low incomes, to put some money into educating their children, because they believe, I think probably rightly, that if they invest in their children's secondary education, they will be able to get some return later in life and it will work for them. So as I say, the first source of investment for education is the state. The second is private individuals themselves as a result of the benefits they derive from education. The third is a whole range of non-governmental organisations, intergovernmental organisations, the World Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, who are very keen to invest in education, particularly, of course, in developing countries, and to help those countries meet their educational challenges. There is a whole string of very problematic issues attached to this. These organisations have got very large amounts of money, but they're not confident, as they try and spend it in many of the countries they want to spend it in, that the money will actually go to the educational purposes that they are giving it for. They're not confident that the money will be well spent. Sometimes they're worried at a basic level of corruption. Other times they're worried that the money won't in fact find its way to educating the people who most need the education, but will simply go to those who are already benefiting from the education system. But there's a large amount of money available from that point of view, and if one could establish an effective way of using that money to really expand educational opportunities and to deal with the talents that really are available and there, then the resource is very substantial. And I should perhaps just mention in that category a range of charities, a range of other types of non-governmental organisations, endowments, which help fund education in an important way. So my first three sources of investment for education are the government, the private individual, and then the non-governmental organisations, thirdly, with intergovernmental organisations, a range of different types, putting resource in, are all quite prominent in the educational field, but all the time thinking, how do we use our investment to good effect? How do we ensure it does, in fact, deliver the goods that we hope it will deliver? And then finally, employers putting money in to education. Potentially a large source of money, particularly in the vocational educational field, but certainly in the UK, and I think the US as well, a pretty patchy system of employers putting money into education. It contrasts with here in Germany, where the main employers in Germany, particularly in the engineering and automotive industries, are ready to invest in the education and training of people to come and work in their companies and in their businesses, and they're ready to make that level of investment in a way that is important and makes a major difference. So what I'm trying to say is you've got a series of different sources of money to invest in the capacities and opportunities of education to take it forward in the most direct way that you can. But then the question arises, when you have the resource for investment, in what do you invest? There are a number of alternatives. You can invest in teachers, in the number of teachers. You can invest in the quality of the teachers. You can invest in the schools and equipment. You can invest in the technology, and there are now fantastic technological resources which are available to help education. You can invest in other staff. You can invest in whole new areas where there has not been investment in the past. And you have to make a choice on a cost-benefit basis where you are going to make your investment and how you're going to carry it through in the most effective way. And that, again, is a difficult question. My own view is that the most important area of investment is in the quality of teaching. And the key people who will make the difference at all the various levels that we're talking about are the teachers themselves. And at all levels of research that have been done, anecdotal evidence as well, indicates that people are motivated by a teacher that really can take them forward into fulfilling their own capacities to a greater degree. But to be quite frank, as one goes around the world, you see completely different levels of teaching capacity to do things. Some teachers are teaching systems, I should say, not individual teachers, are extremely old-fashioned. They operate on a basis of learning by rote. The teacher comes into the class in the morning, delivers himself, and often it is himself, of his thoughts, and then goes away again, and that's it. Other teachers come in, engage with the children, engage in a serious discussion, really look at the individual needs of the individual children, and take it forward in a different way. It takes me a bit towards the reform agenda, which I'm going to discuss in just a second. But it's not always the case that simply investing in more teachers actually makes the difference that one is seeking to achieve. It's often a case of doing it in a completely different way. An example in the UK when I was Secretary of State, at the preschool level, was an enormous programme in which we invested called Sure Start for preschool, which was based on the proposition that if you looked at cycles of educational deprivation in Britain, there were certain communities where people really had almost no chance of going from those communities to higher education later in life, and educational deprivation started at a very young age indeed. Young mothers, young fathers, sometimes the families breaking up, children not getting good attention when they're very young, and then themselves going into a spiral of educational decline later on. And we thought the way to address this was by a programme of preschool education which we called Sure Start. And the idea of the programme was both investment and reform. In each of these communities, about 200 communities throughout Britain, we had new facilities which were there with new staff, new nursery staff, but also a coordination with the other staff who worked with those families in a very direct way. So, for example, working with the community midwives, so that we were working with the mothers before the children was actually born to try and ensure that they had the best possible chance in those circumstances. And a whole set of other professions working with children in a very effective way. And already that attention from a very low age, in some senses even a minus age before the child was born, has meant that in those communities, those children only just beginning to grow up now are getting a much better chance of being able to move forward in the way. And that was an example of investment being targeted, A, in particular geographical communities to attack educational disadvantage, B, at a particular stage where that intervention would be most effective, i.e. very, very young, pre-5. And I should say that all the evidence is that the younger you can intervene with high quality education, the more long-term your results are likely to be. So if you're wanting to make a change, that's the place to try and intervene. And then with a new way of running preschool education in a way that hopefully would enable standards to change and move forward in a significant and positive way. So there are choices about which form of investment is the right form to operate in deciding how you spend the money. As I say, my personal view is that investment in teachers is the most important, but investment in the quality of their teaching rather than simply the number of teachers, though there are many teacher shortages in many parts of the world, but the number of the quality of teachers is extremely important. It's also important to say, and probably most of you, particularly the younger ones, will know better than I, that the way in which education is taking place is being transformed at the moment very significantly in terms of the use of technology. There are a whole set of ways of learning on your mobile phone, on your laptop, in the classroom with interactive whiteboards, electronic interactive whiteboards, which are completely different than was the case when I was your age. And investing in that kind of technology also shows some very positive and beneficial effects. And I'd perhaps just like to make one particular mention, which I think is very important, which is the education of children with special educational needs. If you're talking about inequality, one of the deepest inequalities in society is between people who have particular disabilities and people who don't. And there's a great deal of evidence that if you have a targeted programme on the needs of people with particular special educational needs, using this technology, you really can lift their own achievement and attainment forward in a very dramatic and significant way. So what I'm trying to really describe here in this discussion about investment is to explain that it's not simply enough to say we need to invest more money in education. Some politicians, some people argue, spend more money in education, job done. I think that is not enough. It's a necessary, spending more money is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to using education to attack inequalities at a series of levels. You have to decide where you're going to invest your resources and how you're going to invest your resources, and whether you're going to try and get resources from areas other than government to really make that go. So just to recapitulate what I've said earlier, in terms of the where, the best bangs for your buck in investing in education come the lower down the educational hierarchy that you invest the money. So if you put the money in at preschool, at primary school, that makes the biggest difference in terms of improving educational performance further down the line. There's a geographical and community where as well. If you're ready to focus resources on those communities which have long-standing difficulties in making educational progress, you can see tremendous progress there too. A highly political question, I may say, by the way. If you start saying you're going to invest in areas of educational disadvantage, and that means relatively less for those areas which have more educational advantage, and that of course takes you straight into a political area. You then have to decide, what are you going to invest in? Is it teachers? Is it equipment? How are you going to do it? How are you going to make it happen? But as you make those decisions, as you work your way through the challenges of those decisions, you can see results and you can see things moving forward in a very significant way. I travel around the world a lot these days and meet a lot of people in governments and outside who are trying to focus on these problems. And what I'll say to any of you who are interested in this area, it's a fantastically exciting and vibrant field. You could land down in just about any country in the world and see a really exciting debate taking place about how to make change happen and how to make it move forward in a very positive way. In some senses, the countries in East Asia are those which are moving forward fastest. If you look at some of the education achievements of countries like Singapore, China and so on, it is extremely exciting to see what can be achieved and how fast change is happening. But in the Arab world, in the African continent, there is massive discussion taking place about how this can move on. And of course there are big divisions within Europe as well. The difference between UK universities and universities elsewhere in the European Union is quite substantial. There's a different approach to universities. There's an important issue about the independence of universities and how they operate, and independence of teachers in schools as well and how they operate. And that's why, beyond the investment questions which I've mentioned, I also think it's extremely important to discuss reform in this context as well, and how you change education, not simply saying you put the money in and it stays as it is. So it's the second aspect of reform which I want to come on to now. Education suffers, I think, too much from a sense of complacency and from people defending vested interests within their educational world. I'm a visiting professor at 3 universities in the UK, and so I see these different universities. And what you see is a group of people in these universities, some of them world famous, who, the universities I mean, who are very, very satisfied with the way that things are. If you try and say, actually, we ought to try and change things a bit to help people who have particular disadvantages or particular difficulties, people will agree in principle, but won't be particularly keen on changing the way in which they operate to do it. You can see the same with professions of teachers, secondary school teachers in many countries in the world. The teachers feel they do a good job, they feel these students cause them a problem, and it's a difficulty for them. Why won't they just go away and let them get on with the job of teaching without having the problem of having to teach actual people? I remember when I became Education Secretary, meeting a group of head teachers in my constituency in Norwich, and saying, you know, what did they think the difficulties were? And the problem from their point of view was that that they said to me, and I remember it very well, we had one school in our constituency which was the 4th worst out of about 25,000 schools in the UK, really a poor school. And you talk to the teachers there and said, you know, why is this? And they said, well, you can't do anything with these children. That's it. You can't do anything with these children. We're doing our best, but we can't do anything with these children. I was as angry as I've ever been in politics at hearing this, because the idea that these children were being dismissed as the people with whom you could do nothing was absolutely horrific. The head teachers in the area described the lack of aspiration of families in the Norfolk area, saying actually the parents aren't really wanting them to do any better, so not much we can do. And you've got that appalling bumper sticker which our teachers' trade union uses in the UK. If you can read this, thank a teacher, saying that teachers are the only people responsible for people's ability to read, not parents or family or anybody else helping people to read. I think complacency, we're doing a great job, we teachers, we university professors, it's all going pretty okay. Complacency is an enormous enemy. Because the fact is, we're not all doing okay. Even in a wealthy country like the UK, the difference in educational attainment of people across the whole of the country is dramatic. There are people who routinely will hope to go to university. 4 out of 5 of young people from the upper social classes in Britain will expect to go to university. 1 out of 5 of the people from the lowest 20% of families will expect to go to university. It's an enormous division in a society which is pretty well off and in pretty good shape compared to most people. Is it because those from the poorest haven't got the talent and ability to be able to benefit? It just is not true. It's that those talents and abilities they do have are being wasted rather than being fertilized and used in a whole variety of ways. My former boss, who you mentioned, Mark, Neil Kinnock, when he was leader of the Labour Party, going into the 1992 general election, made a major speech on the eve of the general election, which was noticed by many people. Why am I the first Kinnock, his name was Kinnock, in 1,000 years ever to go to university? And why was it? And he then took it forward more rhetorically than I'm able to do. What were all these other people who were brilliant people? Didn't they have the talent? Didn't they have the possibility? No, it wasn't that. It was that the system didn't work in a way that allowed people from poorer backgrounds to go into university. That speech became famous because a famous American, the current Vice President Joe Biden, plagiarized the speech and used the identical words in a speech in an American election campaign. Why am I the first Biden in 1,000 years ever to go to university? And he got caught, and it was very embarrassing and set back his presidential prospects at the time. But Obama came to help him out a bit later on, and he's now got a greater career. But the reason why he plagiarized is it's because such a powerful political statement. It is a true political statement that it is unacceptable to say that because you're born in a certain social environment, a certain background, from a certain level of relative poverty, actually you're not capable of taking yourself forward into university or elsewhere in life. So I'm describing a country, the UK, which is pretty prosperous, relatively equal compared to many other countries, but where these big divisions exist. You then go around other countries in the world, and those big divisions exist to an even greater extent. If you go to an African country, for example, the people who are going to go to university in most of those countries come from the tiny elite at the core of society, not from the mass of the population. Again, the same question. Is it because the mass of the population is too stupid to go to university, or is it because they've just never had the chance, never had the education, never had the possibility of being able to allow their own talents and their own abilities to come through? So what we have is a situation where there are deep inequalities in the education system. Ironically, where the way to solve those problems is through education itself, enabling people to take themselves forward. But where you've got a large number of people working in the education system who basically are relatively complacent about this state of affairs. I say relatively because, of course, I'm making general comments, and there are a large number of very outstanding people who are trying to change the situation the whole time. So please don't take my general comment as a particular criticism of particular individuals. But there are strong vested interests which say don't change it very much. And so if you've got a length of the working day, a particular form of teaching, a particular arrangement of the teacher contract, a particular exam system, or whatever it is, people say, well, let's just leave it and not address the question of how you make it work better for regular people throughout the society. So I say that it's not enough just to invest, firstly. It's not enough then to decide where you invest with those issues and criteria which I described earlier on. But you've then got to decide, what are you going to try and change in the education system? How are you going to reform the education system so that people are able to, of all backgrounds, are able to fulfill themselves and move forward? And that raises very sharp questions. Just to go through some of them very directly. Teacher quality I mentioned at the level of investment, but it's also critically important at this level of reform. There are many teachers who believe that once they've got their teaching qualification at the age of 22, say, that's okay for the rest of their teaching life. But as I said earlier, in fact, we are going through a period of change which is unbelievably rapid in our society. And the idea that what you learnt 30 years ago is going to be okay for what you need to equip the children of today is just wrong. So you've got to have continuous professional development, as it's called, and there are many programs of continuous professional development, to update teachers in the skills they need to deal with the issues of today, not the issues of 20 or 30 years ago. And that, for my money, is a responsibility of teachers themselves as professional teachers to do that and carry through. But I can tell you, even that simple statement, teachers should take responsibility for their professional development, is a revolutionary demand in some education systems, because teachers say, that's not my job, I'm doing it fine, the other people have to change around. So how you change teacher quality, how you enable teachers to use technology in ways that means that they can teach more effectively and more powerfully and get to people more directly, is a very, very important question. There are important issues of pedagogy, how you teach yourself. The phrase in England used to be chalk and talk, and the idea that the teacher would walk up to the blackboard and literally just write on the blackboard, and you'd take notes, you'd sit in rows as you are now, taking notes, taking it down, and then go away at the end of the lesson. That's how I learnt in the school I was at. It was an extremely ineffective. It reminds me of a true story of a professor when I was doing maths. You said I did maths at Cambridge, and that's right. And the way that maths was taught at Cambridge was the same way. And we had this professor came in, he wrote up the proof that he was doing, writing it up on the board. And to simplify it, he said on the board, if 1 + 1 = 2, then clearly 2 + 2 = 4. And he went on, and he looked back and he said, clearly, now is it clear? If 1 + 1 is 2, then is it clear that 2 + 2 is 4? So he said, wait here a moment. And he went back to his rooms in college, in Trinity College, and he looked it up in his book, and he came back about 7 minutes later and said, yes, it's clearly, on we go like this. And so the point being that he wasn't prepared to explain to the class this logical connection. Now, chalk and talk, this way of teaching, was the way that things were done. It's not really now the way that things are done. Things are done in a much more profound way, of much greater dialogue with individual students. But there are many countries in the world now where still chalk and talk is the way to do it. And there are even countries, and I was at an international educational conference in Qatar in the Gulf last year where people were talking about this in length, where it's not permitted in any way for a student to ask the teacher a question in these circumstances. It's not seen as an appropriate thing to do. And actually, the teachers themselves need to change their pedagogy to engage all of their students and to talk to all of their students. Because again, a truth about inequality, the students who do best in this classroom setting that we have in the room now are the students who are most self-confident and most aware. The students who will say nothing in the whole process and won't be learning as it goes through will be the people who are most uncertain, most unsure of themselves. And so actually, as the whole thing goes on, they will simply be left behind as the process goes forward. So that's the pedagogy, dealing with the rote learning, using the modern techniques, is an absolutely essential part of the reform programme that needs to happen. Reform which includes investment, of course, but reform which is very important in its own terms. A third element is removing the blockages which stop educational progress. In my country, in the United Kingdom, the most significant of those was an examination called the 11 plus, as its name implies, at the age of 11. It still exists in some part of the country, where if you didn't pass this exam at the age of 11, then you simply couldn't go forward into higher level secondary education in the way that was desired, and the whole system was divided into two types of education, so-called secondary modern education, so-called grammar school education, and a decision was taken at the age of 11 that says that's the way you're going and that's the way you're going. You can imagine the dramas and tensions around this examination. There's many, many examples of people at the age of 11 not having developed enough to be able to deal with these things, and deep resentments. A colleague of mine in government, John Prescott, Deputy Prime Minister, was one of those who'd failed the 11 plus test, went into secondary modern, and right to today, he's now over 70, he complains about this bitterness, and he's in fact an extremely intelligent man. He has some other characteristics I don't always appreciate, but he's an extremely intelligent man, and he was categorized as being a second grader at the age of 11 for the rest of his life. Now, these kind of blockages are not the way to proceed. You have to say that every person, everybody in this room, everybody on the street outside, has got possibilities, and the question is helping them to find the route to educational development for themselves, which takes them forward. And you have to try and find that route, and you have to say the blockages we're not going to have there. Big blockage is money, of course, and the question of have people got access to the resource to be able to have education opportunities later becomes a very big question, which of course is why the governments are providing education opportunities so widely. But if you go today to Mumbai and talk to people in Mumbai in India, you'll find this question of what are the blockages is absolutely the core of their thinking, and parents desperately thinking, can they find some way to get their child into a school situation which will fulfill them and take them forward somehow, because they don't have confidence that the schools provided by the state will really succeed in doing that. So removing blockages is a very difficult thing to do, but a very, very important thing to do. And the role of private education within that is a very important and profound aspect of the whole process. Personalisation was a horrible word that was developed, but it was the idea that everybody's different, everybody's got their own educational capacity, everybody's got to be able to fulfil themselves in that way, rather than doing it right across the whole broad. And technology can help that and to take it forward. But the whole purpose of the reform agenda, linked to the investment agenda, is to find routes which will inspire children and young people, find routes which will motivate and inspire children and young people to see what they can achieve within themselves. And it all starts out from the profoundly optimistic view of life, which I certainly share and most people I work with share, that everybody, and I mean everybody, has it within them to achieve and to educate and to develop themselves. And you can't say that group over there, sorry, you haven't got it, that's no good. That everybody has the capacity to do that. But of course there are massive arguments about this. It's a deep political argument as well. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a great American novelist, Kurt Vonnegut. A book he wrote when I was in my early 20s influenced me a lot. It was called Play a Piano, and it was a model of an American town, Troy, Albany, Schenectady, as he did it up in New York. I worked in New York, in Albany, New York, for a few months before I went to university. And he had a vision of the way he thought society was evolving at that time was a city based on three units. The intelligentsia, essentially, the machines, and the proles. And he thought society was evolving in such a way that the intelligent people ran the society, they were the government of the town, they had the machines to help them do it as technology was moving forward very quickly, and then you had the proles outside this, outside the fenced communities, not developing, no possibility for them, just making life in an animalistic type of way. Now, this picture was so horrific to me, but it was almost a model of the natural argument about economic separation of responsibilities. And it seemed to me the absolute antithesis of what we should be trying to achieve in education. You have to say everybody goes with this. And of course, George Bush, No Child Left Behind, I'm not arguing about the particular merits of the program, but the phrase No Child Left Behind stated that the Republican president accepted that every child had a potential, and the education system should be trying to help every child and not simply a select group of children. And that's at the core of this education inequality argument. So to summarise and conclude what I've been trying to say this morning, education is vital for the success of societies, for the economic success of societies, and that extends to all societies. And a major part of that success is reducing inequality, both between societies and within societies. Education is a massive vehicle for doing that. So the first argument is, can we commit to education in order to be able to attack the inequalities, to allow the society to grow, to allow the economy to grow? I maintain that that argument is broadly won, that most governments, most people accept that argument, and that we are at that point. But then you come to the second point, having got to that starting gate, to say that it's not simply about expanding education, not simply about investing in education, but it's about how you invest in education, where you invest in education, and critically linking the investment in education to reform of education, to changing education so it really does serve the needs of everybody. And I've tried to describe in one or two of the examples I've given the very tough and difficult problems that you have to decide about this. If it's investment, where does the money come from? Is it just government money? Is it private money? Is it non-governmental organisation money? Is it employer money? How do you bring more resources in? To everybody literate in the current politics and economics of Western societies, it's an easy thing just to illustrate with a hand gesture. The demand for money on spending is going to go up like this. There's always more money you can spend on education. But the amount of money available from the state for education is going to go up like that, or maybe even go down in the kind of fiscal situation that we are. So how do you fill the gap? Do you say the gap won't be filled? Do you say we go for private money in there? Do you say we go for other kinds of money in there? Do we get employers to put money in there? How do you make it go? Difficult policy choices, difficult problems, difficult tensions. And then, of course, how you deliver education, which parts in the hierarchy from preschool up to university do you really invest in to really try and make a difference? How do you make sure it gets through to really hitting the people you're trying to help? And that's about basics like pedagogy, how teachers teach, and so on in those ways. But education is itself the means of attacking inequality across the globe. It's the major means of doing it, not only economic inequality, but also political inequality, social inequality. And that's why so many people I know are deeply committed to expanding education, to improving it, to changing it, to deliver the changes. And I feel myself very optimistic. When I look now at the situation in the North the Arab world, for example, following the Arab Spring, the commitment to education there is enormous. I was at a meeting in Cairo a couple of weekends ago, and the question of how do you make it happen so that those millions of young people do have a future which really stacks up for them, that's tremendously important, tremendously exciting, and I think should be tremendously motivating. And I hope, Mark, can be an element of the way in which the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy conducts its own work over these next years to focus on how we can help people meet these challenges. Thank you very much.